You've got your four core objectives, right? Growth, employment, inflation, and balance payments. And essays on the consequences of changes in these objectives are really, really common. So, essays on the significance of economic growth, particularly to what extent you should prioritize achieving growth or reducing unemployment or controlling inflation or stabilizing the balance of payments. Those are very, very common type of essay. Now, I think with growth and employment essays, I'm probably not going to cover those with you guys solely because I think they're quite easy. And with the time we have, one lesson per week, if we cover those, we're going to have to exclude other potentially more useful or more difficult, challenging stuff. The two tricky ones are inflation and trade. Now, the situation with trade, I think trade is very unique, the balance of payments, and really you're going to need to wait until you've really, really gone into what the balance of payments is in more detail before I think you can tackle an essay on that with me, for example, or before it will make sense for me to go through that. Whereas inflation, I feel like if you've got the ADAS sort of fundamentals, which I keep banging on about at this point, I very much want you guys to be there. So if you've got the ADAS fundamentals, I think inflation is a bit more straightforward. But I do think this is, like I said, one of the trickier essays on economic objectives and one to watch out for. I think students often feel a bit overconfident about inflation essays, and I just say like be careful, make sure you think about what you're doing, plan the essay out in your head at the very least, don't just go for it. But okay, so I'm gonna start actually with what is it about inflation that can make it quite tricky to deal with as a topic? And the simple reason really is that when we say inflation, we are referring broadly to one of two things happening, right? Either cost push inflation or demand pull inflation. So inflation can be split into sort of two things. Can anyone tell me just briefly in the chat what am I referring to there? Cost pull inflation, cost push inflation, demand pull inflation. Anyone read ahead? Have you guys covered that at school? Or do you need me to expand on exactly what that means? Cost push inflation versus demand pull inflation. I think that's what makes inflation a tricky topic. But what do I mean by that? So Devian has said cost push is when costs of production rise. So the increased cost is passed on to consumers. Perfect. And then demand pull. And in fact, I'm going to draw that out. Looks like we have got no response. All right. I'll be lenient with you guys today and fill in the gaps. So, cost push inflation is when cost of production rise, AF shifts to the right, and you can see the inflation on the y-axis. It's really nice and easy. So very, very simple, right? As Devian has said in his comment, I've got some ones on demand pull as well. As Devian said in his comment, costs rise, and then the producers pass this on in the form of higher prices. So if costs rise throughout the economy, we should see higher prices throughout the economy. But AO2, this is the kind of inflation to a large extent, not to a total extent, but this is the kind of inflation the UK has been dealing with recently and much of Europe, because the inflation we have at the moment is heavily attributed to rising energy prices as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. So rising energy prices, increasing costs of production for firms because they have to pay more for energy. They're passing that increase in costs onto the consumer in the form of high prices. Bam, cost push inflation. So Mira has said perfect. Demand pull inflation, on the other hand, is caused by an increase in AD. And again, I think it should be pretty easy to see why. Why is this inflation? Because the price level is rising. That's the definition of inflation. It's persistent rise in the average price level or the general price level. So you can see in this case, you've got the same result on the y-axis, inflation, but a different fundamental cause, right? One is basically more spending in the economy. That's the second one, demand pull, and the other is higher costs of production. So what I think makes it maybe a bit tricky, like how do we, it makes it a bit tricky to talk about inflation, is because hopefully one of you will notice and put in the comments that in terms of the other effects, these types of inflation are completely different, almost, well, actually polar opposite. What do I mean there? Like these two types of inflation are completely, utterly different. They might as well be different things in some sense. So they have a very polar opposite impact. All right, a couple more people coming in. So in the chat, what do you think I mean now? It's both, it's inflation in both cases, but I wouldn't view them as the same thing. So Devin said one supply side, the other demand side. True, but I want you to think about the other effects. So rather than identifying one is caused by demand and one is caused by supply, think about the broader impact on the economy outside of inflation. What is happening to the economy in the first case versus what is happening to the economy in the second case? I want someone to spot it. Yes, Devian, right. One results in economic growth. Well done, Yati. Well done, guys. So it is really, really simple, actually. Cost push inflation shrinks the economy, results in economic contraction. As costs go up, firms are going to decrease production. It's not going to be as profitable to produce the same amount anymore. So they're going to decrease production. Whereas in demand pull, the additional spending is going to encourage firms to increase production as they can make more profits now. So in the first case, in this kind of inflation, the economy is going to shrink. But with this kind of inflation, the economy is going to grow. And again, if you see what I mean, that sort of means it's a bit misleading to talk about inflation as one thing. A statement like inflation causes growth is a difficult statement because in some cases, inflation is associated with growth. But if it's cost push inflation, then actually the complete opposite is true. So I think that can make it a bit challenging to think about inflation and to bring it into essays because students are often left a bit like, well, what does inflation actually do? I'm not seeing much consistency in what I'm learning about inflation, but often the reason for that is the student hasn't necessarily kind of grasped this dual nature of inflation, the fact that there's really two types of inflation. The other consequences, besides the price level rising, are going to be drastically different between these two cases. So what I typically advise students to do if they're doing an inflation essay is you want to make points about inflation that aren't really specific to either cost push or demand pull. And those are the kind of points I'm going to focus on today. And then you're going to use this as one of your major evals. And if it were me, I would be feeding that heavily into my conclusion as well. So if I got an essay on the consequence of inflation, one of my big evaluations is going to be, it depends massively on the type of inflation. Is it cost push inflation or is it demand pull inflation? And then I'm going to build on that in the conclusion, maybe by discussing which is more likely in the context I'm being asked about. So the UK 2022, for example, this would be more likely. So okay, right, let's get into it then. Let's get our points down. So where is my border? Here we go. So the way I'm going to break it down is effects on consumers, effects on firms, effects on the government, and effects on the economy as a whole. AQA, they don't actually tend to ask essays that require you to do this. Like I haven't seen an essay discuss the effects of inflation on consumers and firms, for example. But they have done it for a couple of other topics once or twice. I feel like I definitely remember unemployment. They did something similar. So it's just sort of a way to prepare in case it happens, basically. But okay, consumers first then. I think I'm just gonna do like a list on the board and then expand the list sort of thing. So consumers, we can talk about real incomes and living standards. Standard of living, SOL. we can talk about shoe leather costs. I quite like this one actually. So firms and hopefully, I mean, again, I'm obviously I don't know exactly where you guys are up to, what you have done, haven't done, but hopefully, like some of this, like the term real income, will be familiar, and you might have an idea of how that works already. Okay, firms. We want to talk about costs and profits. We want to talk about wage cost spiral. We can discuss that in terms of the economy as a whole. Wage. We want to talk about menu costs, although that's not one of my favorite. And I think I'm going to have to do government and the whole economy separately. Okay, someone's just come into the waiting room. Lucky I spotted that one. So the first point, real incomes and standard of living. So this is really, really simple. This is one of the go-to points. For that reason, actually, for top marks, I probably wouldn't use this one because I feel like there's not all that much you can say about it. But basically, your real income is how much spending power you have accounting for inflation. So if your actual income, or we say your nominal income stays the same, but prices rise, then the same amount of money buys you less stuff. And we reflect that by saying your real income falls, and there's an equation to calculate that. I'm not going to get into today, but it's part of index numbers anyway. So if inflation is higher, it's simple as saying people can't afford as much stuff. They can't buy as much stuff unless their incomes rise the same amount as inflation. But of course, that's a potential evaluation. So in that case, they can't afford as much stuff. Their consumption of luxuries is probably going to fall. If they're already not consuming much luxuries, they're going to have to cut back on necessities. Their standard of living is going to fall. If you do want to expand on this, like you do want to get a lot of analysis marks, a trick I would often employ is break standard of living down into material and non-material standard of living, and I explain both. So material standard of living is like the stuff you can buy, how much food you have, the quality of your house, your clothes, blah blah blah. Your non-material standard of living refers to things like your health and happiness, but that is related to how much you can afford, right? Like at the end of the day, if you can't afford to, I don't know, send your kids to a good school or get them a tutor or whatever, that might decrease your non-material standard of living, even though it doesn't necessarily increase like your material wealth or your material possessions. Okay, so material, non-material standard of living can be a good way to break that down. Now, shoe leather costs. This again is another quite easy one, but difficult to expand a lot on. So it would possibly be advisable to combine those into one, because this will also reflect poorly in terms of standard living. So shoe leather cost is the idea that inflation basically means prices are changing rapidly. And consumers will then, if they're rational, they will need to be shopping around a lot to find the best price. Imagine like the price of bread in all the 10 shops near you goes up, but you don't know which bread has gone up by the most or what the new best price to utility bread option is. So you're going to have to be walking around town, or I guess maybe these days, spending minutes going online and researching, finding out what is now the best bread. So this is called shoe leather costs, because the idea that, again, it doesn't really apply very well to the modern day, but the idea is back in the day, people would be walking around town all day, looking at prices, what's gone up the most, what's still affordable, and that's going to wear out the leather on their shoes, which I really like the origin of that name. Because normally in economics, we have like really boring names for stuff, like Ricardian equivalents. I mean, yeah, I mean, shoe leather costs, good name. So spending all this time trying to find the best price because prices keep going up really quickly. You're wearing out the leather on your shoes. Now, one of the reasons I really like this one, and I'm going to go through general evaluations at the end. So I'm going to give you evaluations that you can kind of use with anything. But this has its almost a unique eval that you could use for this one, which I really like. And that is to obviously talk about irrationality. Now, shoe leather costs are going to be very detrimental to a rational consumer because, of course, a rational consumer is going to be driven only by finding the, again, best ratio of price to utility. So as soon as there are rapid price rises across the economy, the rational consumer has to make sure they get the best possible utility for their money. The irrational consumer, though, which is obviously the vast majority of people, I would argue everyone really, the irrational consumer may be lazy. The irrational consumer has bounded rationality. The irrational consumer has habitual behavior. For a number of reasons, the irrational consumer is possibly not going to be interested in going and checking all the prices and making sure they get the absolute best possible ratio of utility to price. So realistically, shoe leather costs might not be that big a consequence for consumers. Maybe for like big items like cars, but people tend to be, of course, more rational when they're about to spend a lot of their money, right? But for small items, again, like bread, I would expect that irrationalities like habitual behavior and bounded rationality or bounded self-control would be significant, would mean a lot of consumers aren't going to bother about shopping around too much. But okay, so firms then costs and profits. This one also quite nice and easy. So typically, and again, we can use the type of inflation as good evaluation here. But typically, we might say if there's inflation, this means the price of inputs into production may be rising. So one of the things inflation is you don't know necessarily exactly what's caused inflation. I mean, an extract might tell you, for example, but if you got say a 25 marker, which is just assess the consequence of inflation, then obviously you don't know like what exactly is causing inflation. But we can say that inflation means stuff is going up in price, right? And that may well mean things that firms need to produce other things is going up in price. So that could be energy, that could be tools or other forms of capital. An interesting argument you can make here is that workers are often going to ask for higher wages in order to compensate for the higher inflation, right? So if you're a worker and you know prices are rising, but your wage stays the same, as we discussed earlier, your real income is going to fall. So you're going to have an incentive to go into your boss and say, look, inflation's 8%, whatever, can you increase my wages a bit so that I can still afford to buy things. So obviously that means costs for firms rising. You could show this in a micro diagram really well. Marginal cost, average cost shift upwards. Profits will fall. You could expand on that as well, but I think that's a really, really nice, simple point. Investment levels in the economy may then fall. So very, very easy. And thinking about the evaluation, the demand pull versus cost push argument works really well here. Because if it's demand pull inflation, think about it. Firms may face higher costs as wages rise. Demand for labor is effectively rising in that scenario, but they're going to be counteracted by the higher demand in the first place, right? The higher demand justifies the higher cost of production because the higher demand allows you to make more profit. So in a demand pull scenario, firms' profits are going to increase, not decrease. In a cost push inflation scenario, that's the one where costs are more likely to rise and not be compensated for by rising demand. Okay, in the cost push scenario, in fact, demand is going to fall, a contraction of demand as prices rise. So effectively, you've got, I think, a really nice setup there because again, that is, I think, should be used as an eval in an inflation essay. It would boggle my mind for someone to not use it if they knew about it. But okay, wage cost spiral is sort of an expansion at this point about wages, where workers will be asking for higher wages. And you can use this to talk about the economy as a whole as well, rather than just firms.
But this problem of rising costs can cause a sort of domino effect, or I think a better expression, but maybe a more complicated one, is a sort of positive feedback loop or a feedback loop where I'll draw it actually. So
let's say you've got inflation, and as a result, there are increased wage demands. As a result, costs of production go up. Can anyone see the problem?
put it in the chat, please. Hopefully the way I've drawn it makes where I'm going pretty clear. Harsh says multiplier effect. It isn't the multiplier effect, but it is very similar concept where you have this multiplicative effect. So I'm pretty sure like you've got the right idea, but the pedantic economist in me is saying the multiplier effect refers to a very specific phenomenon, which is similar to but not this phenomenon. Dia says cost of production increases equals more inflation. Exactly. And therefore, you see, we have a cycle, right? We have a feedback loop where the inflation makes people ask for more wages, which means firms' costs go up, which means they have to increase prices further, creating more inflation, which is going to mean more pressure on workers to ask for higher wages, which is going to mean costs may go up, which means more inflation. And as far as governments are concerned, this is one of the most frightening consequences or potential consequences of inflation, because what you would get is a sort of ever escalating runaway train of higher and higher prices. And in places like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, which have had like over 100,000% inflation or 1,000,000% inflation, according to some economic reports in Venezuela, like 2019, um, that's sort of why that's happening. You've got this sort of feedback effect where inflation is creating more inflation, creating more inflation. So obviously, if that happens, then you've got an almost impossible situation for them. So it's something that's going to be very detrimental to their profits. So okay, menu costs. This one, again, I feel a bit like shoe leather costs. It can be a little difficult to expand all by itself. But menu cost is basically that firms have to update their price lists now, and you can use this as potential evaluation. For some firms, this isn't a big deal. But for other firms, say a restaurant, which is again where the idea comes from, you'd literally have to create new menus. So let's say inflation is 10% this year. You're running a Chinese restaurant, my favorite. Singapore noodles, my favorite, right? Prawns have got more expensive, chicken's got more expensive. All the key ingredients of Singapore noodles have got more expensive. You need to increase the price from $7.95 to $8.95, but that means you need to print loads of new menus, right? So, and that's for all restaurants all across the country. Now, again, I think as a potential eval, this maybe isn't as significant as it used to be. And in this case, the evaluation isn't to do with the rationality or irrationality of firms, but the digitization of menus, for example, makes it much easier to change them. So for me, in terms of menu costs, when I want to increase my prices due to inflation, or if I just want to increase my prices for any reason, I just log into my tutoring advertising platform and I change the number, and it takes literally 5 seconds. I don't have to print actual menus or hand out new leaflets. So back in the day when this theory originated, yes, menu costs possibly would have been quite significant because there would have been associated like physical printing costs or distribution costs or whatever. But nowadays, when many businesses have online menus, digital menus, effectively digital pricing information is much easier to change, and therefore menu costs not as significant.